What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Factory Tour. I am your host, Paul Patterson. I am joined today by a special guest named Mike. You probably know him by his Twitter handle, his alter ego, Dynasty Zoltan. I've been on Mike's show a couple of times. We've put together some great content. I think we've had some really good conversations. We talked earlier this offseason about some prospects, famously called Jahmyr Gibbs a top 5 fantasy running back, dynasty running back before the NFL draft. Hoping we can make some more magic here today. Mike, how are you?
Doing really well. That Jahmyr Gibbs prediction is looking good now as he sits in the consensus top 5. So always good to be early on things, and that's what you're providing here.
Yeah, so I'm gonna hang my hat on that one. You know, it's one of my better calls this offseason. I feel good about it. We'll touch on Gibbs in a little bit because we are going to be talking all things running back today, and we're gonna break down all these running backs into tiers. So I did a few episodes back. I did this with my friend Ben. We broke down all the dynasty quarterbacks into tiers by ADP, worked our way through, just kind of touched on interesting storylines, some fades, some targets, just naturally worked our way through the position. And when we were finished, we felt like we had a better understanding of how we wanted to handle things in our leagues as far as quarterbacks go. So I'm going to try and do this with another position. I know you know your stuff on running backs and every position really, but you've got some great takes on running backs. So we're going to do running backs today. I have the tiers. I'm using bulletproof ADP here, which is for, and I just have the last month of drafts pulled up. So the dust kind of settled from rookie draft season. And this should hold pretty steady throughout the summer, barring any massive news. So hopefully this will be, fresh content for the people for a couple of months, get them through the summer, figure out how they can navigate the position. Before we dive into each individual tier, do you have any kind of, general thoughts on the running back market right now and trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, overall, it's a very interesting position for the dynasty running backs where we really only have like 4 or 5 options who are young and elite and really proven in that way. You could argue we only have 2 or 3. And then we have a whole group of kind of the middle-aged veteran guys who people are a little bit iffy on. It's risky on whether they're going to keep their jobs. And then we have the older vets. And when you think about it, it really comes down to the draft class that everyone thought was going to really replace the running back position, being J.K. Dobbins, Cam Akers, Jonathan Taylor, Antonio Gibson. That draft class has only produced 3 RB1 seasons. We've had big injuries to Dobbins and Akers that have really set it back quite a bit. And then, of course, this draft class this year was not nearly as productive for the running back position as we expected. So there is a good amount of veteran depth here, but in terms of stable dynasty assets, we are strongly lacking at the running back position.
Yeah, we are ripe for an influx of massive talent. And I don't know if we're going to get it just because this draft capital for running backs just seems to keep falling off year after year. But You're absolutely right. 2020 was a huge disappointment looking back. It was really supposed to reset the market and be like that next 2017 class. And it just did not come to fruition. So that's how we end up with this very murky position. And I got to be honest, I felt a lot more confident about the position as a whole when we talked about quarterbacks. Like, I think I have a pretty set philosophy on how I attack the position and I know what I'm trying to do. I'm very much still figuring it out with running back. And I definitely have thoughts. I have some philosophy, but I'm hoping that you'll kind of help clear things up for me. And as I get it later into the offseason, I try to position my teams for contending, rebuilding, that this show might help me figure out what I want to do with certain guys. So let's jump in here at the top. Our first tier is a tier of 1. This being the undisputed RB1 in Dynasty. I don't think that there's any controversy about this. I haven't even seen any like clickbaity takes on Twitter, which means it must really, really be set in stone. And that's Bijan Robinson. He's the 111 in Dynasty startups right now. He's far and away the RB1. He's gone first by a mile in every startup that I've been in this offseason. So Mike, what do you think of Bijan Robinson and his current cost in the dynasty landscape?
I'm good with his current cost right now. You could argue it's a little bit high, just given I do like some of the players in this next tier, which we'll get to in a minute. But we said that there is no safety at the running back position. We're missing on that youth elite talent. And Bijan Robinson is the guy who really checks every single box. The landing spot was pretty much perfect. Last year, Atlanta was second in rush rate over expectation. They were first in rush attempts and third in rushing yards, led by a wide receiver and a fourth round rookie as their starting running backs. So we know that Atlanta wants to run the ball. We know that Bijan is, a generational talent. So I don't have a whole lot to say here, except in my personal rankings, I would take all of the quarterbacks essentially over Bijan Robinson, as well as Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. I am happy building a team somewhat around a guy like Bijan because I do like kind of the hero running back strategy right now. But given just the risk at any running back, I am taking guys like Kyler Murray and Deshaun Watson, Bijan Robinson, even though obviously ADP doesn't say that.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that Jacob Sanderson said on one of his podcasts. He's on a bunch of them, but he was like, I think Bijan's price is right, but I find it much more palatable to trade for him in existing leagues than to actually draft him in a startup. So like value wise, I think it's dead on, but it is hard, like you said, to pass up on some of the quarterbacks just because when you're doing a dynasty startup, you're trying to lay the foundation for your team to be successful for multiple seasons. And whereas in managed, existing leagues, you can already have that quarterback position figured out, and then you can go try and add Bijan on and turn your contender into a true favorite. So that's where I really want to get Bijan. I haven't taken him in any startups. I had some really bad teams from last year that did manage to get the 101, but I'm trying to, my contenders, if I have excess value or I can consolidate multiple pieces, by 2024 first, I'm willing to go and pay up to get Bijan. I think you shouldn't be afraid just because he's a running back. I think he's going to retain his value really well. And I think he also can be a league winner this season. So that's sort of a unique proposition where you have a guy who's really, really young and able to contribute a lot of points above replacement. That's a rare opportunity. So you want to be willing to buy into that.
Yeah, you're spot on. The difficulty is finding the perfect trade partner. And I'd be interested to see if you have any thoughts on this or trades that you've made. But if you think about the teams that are willing to sell Bijan Robinson, it's really only if they're not contending and potentially quite a bit away from contending. And in that case, it's hard as a potential win now team to have those extra pieces that trade partner might want. So one situation where I was able to do that is, let's say you were able to draft Bryce Young or CJ Stroud because you had someone else's top 5 rookie pick or even your top 5 rookie pick, and now you're looking to compete. Maybe you flip that quarterback plus a future first for Bijan. Maybe you have a running back like Kenneth Walker, who took a big value hit. You were counting on him to help you in your title push this year. So you trade Kenneth Walker plus the first for Bijan. Those trades make sense. But in a lot of cases, like I'm having trouble finding a team that has enough value to trade for Bijan to put him over the top, but also that is like ready to really compete with him.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not going to work in a lot of scenarios, but for the most part, the teams that did get the 101 are not necessarily in fantastic shape. So if Bijan did go to one of those teams that's looking to rebuild, I really like those suggestions you threw out. And I'd also be comfortable taking someone like a Jalen Waddle, a T. Higgins, Devonta Smith, somebody who's a young receiver, which is appealing to a rebuilding team that doesn't necessarily offer that kind of, league breaking ceiling. Pair that player with a 2024 first, especially if you think your first is going to be late. I'd be very comfortable making that kind of move because Bijan, not only do I believe he'll be a first round startup pick again this time next season, but he could put up 20 points per game. Like the Atlanta offense is going to be so efficient on the ground, and it's going to be so consolidated in the target share between London, Pitts, and Bijan. I think that he absolutely has a case to be ranked as the RB2 in redraft formats. So if you, even the RB1, I think you could make an argument for. And so for a player like that, who's 20, 21 years old, that's a kind of upside that's really, really hard to find. So
yeah, you're right. I don't see the RB1 argument, but yeah, I think being in that tier behind RB1 from a redraft perspective makes sense. And I like what you're saying because you can replace a guy like Jalen Waddle's production by trading a second rounder for Keenan Allen, let's say, right? Like
Exactly.
you can replace that wide receiver production. So if you want to move a guy like Waddle or, Garrett Wilson to go get Bijan, I completely understand that.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. I think we handled that tier of one. Let's move on to the next tier, which has 4 running backs in it. These 4 are going to be Christian McCaffrey, Brees Hall, Jonathan Taylor, and Jahmyr Gibbs. They cover an ADP range from the 205 to the 302. That's where CMC goes to the 05, all the way to Gibbs at 02. They've kind of pushed together over the course of the offseason where there was more of a gap between them. I think CMC was going a little bit earlier, Gibbs was going a little later, and they've kind of met here a little bit in the middle. But these are your truly elite assets at the position where you've got some combination of like absolutely massive ceiling, huge value upside. Most of these guys are young other than McCaffrey, but there's something here for everybody. Do you have a preference in this tier, somebody you like to invest in on your teams?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I'll just say I do like to invest in this tier. I think that all of these guys are pretty appropriately priced. I look at specifically Brees Hall and Jonathan Taylor. Those guys are kind of all that you want from a running back in the dynasty realm. Like they're young, they have shown elite upside. Brees has more receiving upside than a guy like JT does, but I think his is a little underrated. Obviously, he's coming off an injury. I think Brees Hall is an incredible buy right now, and I actually think he's pretty close to Bijan Robinson. If he didn't get injured last season, I think he would probably be drafted maybe ahead of Bijan Robinson. He was certainly trending that way. I mean, he was arguably the best running back in the NFL last year. He was first in yards per carry, elusiveness, explosive run rate, second in yards after contact per attempt, yards per route run. He was really just an elite option. So I am all in on Brees Hall.
Mhm.
And I'm going to let you talk a little bit more about Gibbs, but obviously I'm in on Jahmyr Gibbs at that cost. I've gotten him, I think, in 4 out of my 5 startups since the rookie draft. And I'm just all in at that cost if you can get him at the 2-3 turn.
Yeah, I was going to ask you who you have as your RB2, but I guess that's been pretty much settled. It's Brees Hall.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I have Brees as my RB2 as well. I have no idea, where I'd have him barring the injury, but what you say makes a lot of sense. He was really blowing up there. He looked fantastic. He was getting so many targets. Now you bring in the huge quarterback upgrade in Aaron Rodgers. I mean, if there were no health concerns going into the season, I think he would be in that conversation as a top 5 redraft pick as well. So it makes a lot of sense. And he's still only like 22 years old. He was very young entering the league. So I do love Brees, absolutely willing to buy him. And I'm starting to become more optimistic about his outlook for this season. It just
Me
seems like
too.
we've gotten so many positive reports, and he is so young and such a solid athlete. Like, I think we could see him come out and, I don't know, just come out and perform at roughly his level from last year pretty early on in the season. And then from there, I mean, he's just going to shoot up the rankings. So
What do you think of the rumors this offseason? I know there were some rumors that the Jets were interested in Jahmyr Gibbs and might have taken him at the 15th pick. And now there's rumors that they're interested in Dalvin Cook. Do you think that says anything about how the Jets see Brees Hall, or is it just your random offseason BS?
I'd be lying if I said I have a really well thought out take on it. I guess I would say that Jahmyr Gibbs is one of those guys where I think coaches talk themselves into seeing him as more of like a weapon than a running back. I think that drafting him wouldn't necessarily be an indictment on the current running back room. It's more one of these things where coaches overthink the way they want to deploy players. And so they see what Gibbs can do on the field and they think like, wow, I could use him as like this Swiss Army knife who can do everything. It's kind of like Tavon Austin, but good, I guess. And so I don't know. I don't know what that says about Hall. Maybe they were more concerned about his recovery timeline at that point, but the Cook rumors are more recent. So yeah, it's hard to say there if there's maybe some residual concern about that, or maybe they just really want to have good depth. They don't have anybody really behind Hall. Like Michael Carter is terrible. Zonovan Knight's terrible. Izzy Abanikanda interesting, but he's a 5th-round rookie. Like maybe this is just a contending team that wants to make sure they have all their bases covered. And if they can get Dalvin Cook to be a backup / early season fill-in for an affordable price, then they want to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, and we know how much Rodgers likes to use his running backs and the passing game, so that would make sense there. I'm interested in Christian McCaffrey because he's obviously the odd man out here, 27 years old, has the most production history of any of these guys. Do you personally have him in this tier? I know ADP has him at RB2, but how do you feel about CMC's value?
I do have him in this tier. I'd have him kind of neck and neck with JT. I think if you're going into if you have a very, very strong team, I think he's the kind of player worth investing in, like maybe turning a Jonathan Taylor into a McCaffrey. If, you're trying to get your team into that contention for the number 1 seed. If I'm not a heavy favorite, it's really hard to justify rostering him because he has so much downside risk where, any kind of injury this year, it's probably over for him. We don't really know what it's going to look like after this year. He's 27 years old, and people try to say that he's going to have a longer career because he's a pass catcher. I don't really think we've seen evidence that that's like a thing that actually exists. We look at the running backs that are aging. Derrick Henry's more of a rusher. Nick Chubb's more of a rusher. Adrian Peterson was a rusher. Like, I don't necessarily think he's going to last longer in the league because he's a pass catcher. High volume is high volume, and he has dealt with injuries in the past. So he does scare me a little bit, and I don't have a lot of shares, but he might be a guy that I try to pick up, on my best teams. If I have some excess value, I can kind of push in for a true blue chip asset, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I don't like him where his ADP is at the 205, but in most drafts that I've done, he ends up falling to the 2-3 turn. And at that point, I'm comfortable with him because you're deciding between guys like him or Kelsey or Tyreek Hill. They all provide essentially the same type of value at different positions. And comparing him to a guy like, I don't know, Chris Olave or Bryce Young, who goes around that range, who might never provide that kind of game-breaking production, I agree. I'm happy with CMC around this area.
Yeah, I did just take him at the 212 in a mock draft that we were doing for the site, and I was building more of a contending roster. So I started with Mahomes and then took McCaffrey. I did take Olave. I was thinking of taking Kelsey and McCaffrey, but I kind of chickened out. Even though it was a mock draft, so that's kind of silly. But I kind of chickened out on like the 2 super aging assets, but yeah, you could definitely take him. The thing about taking him there in a startup is that it does kind of lock you into a certain build so early,
and
on
it locks you in so early. And it's not like Jonathan Taylor, where even if you decide to not really be a huge contender year one, Jonathan Taylor still has utility. The tough thing about McCaffrey, there's only 3 teams in your league who's even interested in him if you want to make a trade. So it can be difficult to trade a guy like McCaffrey. So I agree with you. It's locking you in too early.
Exactly. So for a different reason than with Bijan, I think he's another guy where I'd rather trade for him where my team is kind of set up for him already, as opposed to drafting him and then trying to figure out the rest, because you just don't know who's going to fall to you in a startup. Is it going to be conducive to building a win now team? Because if the value starts to fall where you can build more of a productive struggle roster, you're going to be, kicking yourself that you invested your 2nd round pick in a 27-year-old running back. So I think you have to tread lightly in startups, but a guy that I'm willing to push the chips in on certain teams. With Gibbs, yeah, I mean, I love the price. I was able to pick him up earlier in the offseason, like post NFL draft in the late 3rd a couple of times. He's actually my most rostered running back, as long as you don't count like guys that have their ADPs in the 200s. And I'm loving it. I mean, I'm really excited to see what he can bring to the field. I think he has a lot of upside as soon as this year. Yeah, if you look at Saquon Barkley, Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, Reggie Bush, these are all guys that hit 80 plus receptions in their rookie years, and I think Gibbs could be the next guy to join them. They all had 19% target shares or better, and we know Gibbs has all the talent in the world as a pass catcher. If you look at this Detroit Lions offense and kind of base projection of maybe 575, 580 pass attempts, it would only take like a 17.5% target share to get up to 100 targets. And then you throw in 9 or 10 carries a game. I think there's a really clear path to low end RB1 production, at least this season. Do you think he could hit at that level?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think he's incredibly cheap, especially in redraft, but he's well or underpriced in Dynasty as well. It doesn't take that much usage if you're getting that type of receiving work to be elite. I was in a Twitter conversation the other day where, someone was saying if he's getting 12 to 15 touches, how does he get to be an RB1? It's really not that hard. I mean, Swift was an RB1 per game last year, and he only had 13 touches a game. So if we're going to say that Gibbs is a better running back, he has better draft capital, maybe he'll get a few more touches. It's really not that hard. Gibbs could only have 3 touchdowns next year. And if he gets 5 catches and 7 carries a game, he's going to be an RB1.
Yeah, I think people kind of overestimate the points per game needed to sneak into that low end RB1 range.
It's not hard.
And I think that people still don't understand the difference between a target and a carry. Like the discussion around raw touches is just deeply flawed because a target is worth like 2.5 times as many fantasy points as a carry. And he's going to be, right up there in targets, probably top 5 at the position in targets on a really strong offense. So, he's not precluded from scoring touchdowns either. Even if David Montgomery is their preferred goal line back, I'm sure he's going to break off some big plays. He's going to be in there on certain series. They're probably going to draw up some plays for him, in the red zone, passing plays, swing route, screen plays, whatever. He has a really big chance to score really well as a rookie, which is going to be great for his dynasty value. I think he has a very good chance to be the RB3 in dynasty by this time next year.
Yep, me too.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. If you put a gun to my head and you said, okay, it's Bijan, it's Breece Hall, and then it's who, I think it's very likely that it's Jahmyr Gibbs after that. So he's a guy I really want to invest in because I can use him now. I can reap the rewards in terms of value, and I could sell him if I want, or I can just ride it out. It's just, he's a guy that gives you a lot of flexibility. And we know that these first round rookie running backs are great bets to accrue value in year 1. So yeah, very happy to have him. All right. Perfect. Let's look at this next tier then. So we've covered 5 running backs. This next tier is much larger. It's Saquon Barkley, Austin Eckler, Travis Etienne, Kenneth Walker, Josh Jacobs, Najee Harris, Ramondre Stevenson, Nick Chubb, and Tony Pollard. This covers a range from 307 to 504. It's a very big tier, but I couldn't really figure out where to cut it any earlier. To me, these guys are all in the same tier, generally speaking. Not that I don't have my preference, but I do think that they all belong in this conversation for one reason or another. And I think this is the tier that's really going to determine fantasy championships this year, especially in dynasty leagues. I think navigating this tier, because some of these guys are going to be high-end RB1s, real difference makers, and some of them are going to really disappoint based on where their ADP is. So do you have a favorite from this group?
It's kind of a cop-out, but my favorite is just going to be whoever's cheapest. I see people take Saquon Barkley in the middle of the 3rd round, and I just don't get it at all. Like, why? Like, he is not going to score better than Tony Pollard this year, than Ramondre Stevenson this year, than Austin Eckler this year. He has more injury issues. He's the same age. He's at least older than Ramondre is. So Saquon is definitely my least favorite. My number 1 recommendation that I've made to my various patrons has been to acquire either Ramondre or Tony Pollard. If you're on a team that's contending and needs that extra boost, I feel that those 2 players are really good bets to finish in the top 10 this year. They have immense upside. We already saw some of that last season, and this season they enter as the clear RB1s in their offenses. And I think that they're pretty cheap. Like, you can get Ramondre or Pollard for a late first. You're not going to be able to get Saquon for a late first. So I'm happy taking those guys. I'm happy with Josh Jacobs. I don't see any reason he should drop off from last year. I think the more interesting guys, like, I kind of see this as two groupings, right? You got Pollard, Ramondre, Chubb, Najee, Saquon. Then you got kind of Kenneth Walker and ETN in another bucket. And then you got Eckler as kind of the slightly older guy. Do you find yourself leaning towards one of these players or a group of these players more than another?
I think we're seeing eye to eye here. I totally agree. I was going to make the same point about Barkley, that I don't think, if you look at his like median projection for this season, I don't really see what makes him a massively better bet than Pollard or Ramondre or Jacobs. Like, when I'm in a best ball draft, I'm happy to be at that late 2nd round and just soak up the value on those other running backs. It feels like you're just paying for name value, because I mean, we saw him last year handle a ton of touches, and I mean, did he even have 18 points per game? I don't think he did.
No.
Yeah.
And if you're going to go for a guy like Saquon, just go get Austin Eckler, who's cheaper. And Eckler's had 21 points a game the last 2 seasons, while Saquon hasn't been above 18 since his rookie year. So the Saquon investment doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I'm not investing in Saquon. I'm not really investing in Eckler either. He makes me a little bit wary just because his efficiency as a rusher has really fallen off. And I don't know. It's like he has gotten all these targets, but it seems weird that a guy his size has scored so many touchdowns over the past 2 years. It just doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would keep up. And with the Chargers having, I don't know, like they've had a good offense, but they've also struggled in some key spots. And maybe they want to kind of rework the offense to not feature a 28-year-old, 200-pound running back so much in the passing game. Like maybe they want to, use Quentin Johnson more, use Mike Williams more down the field. Justin Herbert is like way too talented to have an ADOT that low. So yeah, I don't know. There's something about that whole situation that makes me a little bit anxious, and I don't think he would thrive in another environment either. So I'm kind of avoiding him. I'd much rather go all the way down to the bottom of this tier and pick up, like you said, whoever's left. Usually it's either Pollard or Ramondre. They typically have the latest draft position of this group. And yeah, I really love the way that they project for this year. I think there are definitely a lot of dynasty gamers that are wary to invest in a 25 to 26-year-old running back for fair reasons. I mean, we've been burned before, but I think what's missed, and I didn't really come up with this. I think I heard it on the Legendary Upside podcast sometime. I don't know. Stuff just comes in my brain and it's just like bounces around in there and then it comes out. But if you think about running backs, like even the young ones aren't really good ways to store value.
Yeah.
If you look back over the years, guys like Antonio Gibson, Miles Sanders, Cam Akers, DeAndre Swift, these guys were second, third round startup picks that never paid off their price in terms of production. And then they sunk like stones when they experienced injuries, when they didn't get the usage people expected. They didn't hold their value. Like they got all this hype going into year 2 or year 3, and then they just bottomed out and you never really got anything out of it. And so when I'm buying a running back or I'm drafting a running back, my primary interest, like the vast majority of the reason I'm taking that player, is immediate points. What am I getting out of them this year? And in that way, like, honestly, look at redraft rankings or like best ball ADP. That's pretty close to what the dynasty rankings should look like. There aren't really that many massive exceptions. If you're not getting a lot of production out of a running back right now, then they probably are overvalued, relative to where they're going in dynasty.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. I mean, it's not a good store of value anyways, so you shouldn't care about value as much. Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Kenneth Walker, because he's a guy who might go against that grain a little bit, where hypothetically he should be a good store of value. He's a talented player. He's only entering his second year, but the whole Charbonnet's not going anywhere anytime soon. He's going to, his contract goes just as long as Kenneth Walker does, actually a year longer. So what are you doing with Kenneth Walker, who's probably not giving you RB1 value this year, although I have some contention to that. And is he worth holding at this point?
Well, that's interesting. Now I want to hear your contention to that, because Walker is definitely my least favorite guy in this tier. Yeah. I had 0 shares prior to the Charbonnet draft pick, so I have acquired 0 shares since. I haven't really had to do a lot of thinking about what to do with Kenneth Walker, but yeah, I'm a pretty heavy avoid. I just think I didn't like his prospects as a pass catcher. I didn't think he was going to be used that way. And now it's pretty clear he's not going to be used that way. And Charbonnet is not going to get no carries. And so it's just like, for Walker to hit as like a legitimate RB1, it just feels like a very narrow path where he's going to need to have like 15, 16 touchdowns or something like that, where I don't know, I'm just comfortable going with any of these other guys. Even if I do think he's more likely to retain a little more value than some of these older guys, especially like an Eckler or Barkley, I just don't know if I care, because I don't know if he's ever going to be giving me more than like 13, 14 points per game.
Yeah, which makes sense. And again, from a value perspective, like what you're saying is spot on. I think where I'm a little bit more optimistic with Walker is there is room in this offense for him to be on that RB1, RB2 border. And in that case, you are kind of playing the middle game where you're getting some good production from him and you're maintaining value, because the truth is, any of the other guys that we've mentioned, other than maybe ETN, who like is a little bit different, if they get injured, their value goes to almost zero. And during next off season, there's going to be rumors that they're going to draft someone or trade for someone basically no matter what. Like as soon as you get past your league's trade deadline, Tony Pollard and Ramondre Stevenson's value goes way down because people are going to assume that the Cowboys and Pats are going to add someone. So I like Walker a little bit more than you, it sounds like. But again, I'm just taking the last guy in this tier. Basically, the way that I view it is if I haven't drafted a running back before the 5th round, let's say, or before the 3rd round, let's say, one of the top 5, I'm definitely taking at least one guy in this tier. And if I am not, then I'm definitely punting. And there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, in a startup with punting. But if I'm contending, I almost always have either Chubb or Pollard or Ramondre or Jacobs, or oftentimes 2 or 3 of those guys.
Yeah, and I like that approach. I guess my pushback would be this: like if you're in a startup, right, and you've got to pick where you're kind of positioned in the middle of this tier and you can't trade back, are you taking Walker over? Who are you taking Walker over out of this group? Like I definitely would take him over Najee Harris. I don't know if I would take him over anybody else in this tier.
So I would take him over Nick Chubb, who I do think is in for a big year. The issue with Nick Chubb is just age. I don't think he has, like, his value is guaranteed to go down after this year purely due to age.
Right.
Austin Eckler, I'll probably take, I don't know. I'll probably take him over Eckler just because I want the flexibility there. But otherwise, you're right. I mean, I haven't drafted Walker in any of my startups. Who I would take him over is, I know we're not talking about wide receivers, but some of these mediocre wide receivers who are going in the 5th round, like Michael Pittman and DJ Moore. I'm taking Walker over guys like that. But I agree, from the running back position, I'm probably waiting until the like early 5th and just hammering Ramondre and Pollard. Yeah, by the way, my comparison now for Walker's usage is Tony Pollard last year. If that gives you a little bit of a picture of what his upside might be.
I think Pollard, I'd be surprised if he's really used the way Pollard was as a receiver. But yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. You know, he's the explosive runner. He's going to break off big plays. If the offense can run a lot of plays and he can be really efficient, you could definitely still see some utility out of him. I forgot Nick Chubb was in this tier. I think that's a good call. I'd probably take him over Chubb. And I would take him over those wide receivers. Speaking of DJ Moore, I feel like he's the perfect example of how wide receivers are a store of value and not running backs. Like, he's been at the top of the rankings for how many years in a row and like never paid off at all. And he just he'll drop like half a round every year and just never go away. Like that's really, if you want to store dynasty value, like go get a young wide receiver, but don't go draft a young running back thinking that that's some kind of safe investment, because it just is not. And honestly, the guy that heads up this next tier is the perfect example of that. So tier 4, we have Javonte Williams, J.K. Dobbins, Dameon Pierce, and Derrick Henry. They're very tightly grouped. I think all 4 of these guys go in a range of 6 picks from the 511 to the 603. But they're very different types of players. You have Derrick Henry, who's like kind of a contention only play. Obviously, I think he's 29. And then you have Javonte Williams, who's more of a rebuild target, although I think that's kind of misguided. And then you have Dobbins and Pierce, who you can hypothetically draft on any kind of team. They're still pretty young. They look like they'll score points this year. What do you think about this group?
So Dameon Pierce, I think, is a terrible, terrible pick in this group. I don't understand his value at all. I think we essentially saw his ceiling last year. I think Devin Singletary is going to get a lot of work. I see no receiving upside for Dameon Pierce. He's going to be on maybe the worst offense in the NFL. So if I want production, I'm going to go with Derrick Henry. If I want some type of either near-term or long-term upside, I'm going to go with Javonte and Dobbins. How good would Pierce have to be for him not to have questions about his usage going into next offseason? I just don't see it as really that likely.
Yeah, I think he is a touch too high here. I mean, I would never take him over Dobbins. That's for sure. Like, I think Dobbins offers you everything Pierce does and more. Like, he's going to be in a much better offense. He's a more talented player. I don't really see what the case would be to take Pierce over him. I understand why someone would take Pierce as opposed to Derrick Henry in a certain build, but at that point, I'd rather just wait at the position and take somebody else. So, yeah, I'm not really going to get any of him at this price. I think Javonte is still pretty overpriced here as well. I can't recall if you're a Javonte guy or not. I
Yeah.
think his
So
price is better than it was earlier this offseason. Like he's gone down because I remember a time when him and Dobbins were over a round apart, and I thought that
yeah.
made no sense because I'd personally take Dobbins over him in pretty much every situation. But now that they've kind of converged on each other, I think it's at least a more reasonable bet.
So I'm curious if Javonte didn't get hurt, or look, I guess it's hard to say because you don't know how the rest of last season would have gone. But let's say Javonte was coming into this year with a clean bill of health. Let's say he broke his ankle instead of tore his ACL, so he's going to be healthy this year. Would you have him in the tier above, or what would you be thinking about him?
I think he'd be more likely to be at the tail end of that previous tier above. But also we'd have more information on him, right? Like we really don't know what his deployment will even look like once he's fully healthy because we only got that maybe 1.5 games of him as like a full-on workhorse. Before that, Melvin Gordon was keeping him at bay pretty well, which is kind of scary considering that Melvin Gordon became the worst running back in the NFL the second he was released by the Broncos. Like, I mean, that you can definitely chalk it up to incompetent coaching. It probably was, but we just don't know with Sean Payton coming in. We don't know with Javonte's track record where he always has kind of split the backfield. Like, do we know that he's going to get that full-time usage at some point? Because I'm not confident that he's going to be fully healthy this year. And if he is, it's not till late in the year. And then after he is healthy, I still have questions about what his role is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I personally am higher on Javonte than this, and it's purely just an evaluation thing for me. I was incredibly high on him coming out of college. You're right. There are a lot of issues there, but I view Javonte, I mean, he got 21 targets in the first 3 games of last season before he got injured. I think he has that receiving upside, and I think he's just a more talented running back than any of the guys we're going to discuss, other than guys like Derrick Henry, who obviously have just, aged out a little bit. Personally, I have Javonte in tier 3. I have him above guys like Nick Chubb, above Najee Harris, above ETN. I'm pretty in on Javonte. It looks like he's not going to be on the pup and will probably, split carries the first few weeks. And I think he's going to be that 60-40 guy. To me, I like him as a buy low right now. But again, I don't love taking him in the 5th round. A guy like Quentin Johnston, for instance, who's going in a similar range, just has so much more value upside and value safety that I totally understand taking not going running back in this position. I probably wouldn't take a running back in, early to mid round 5 at this point.
Can we circle back quickly to the last tier then? Because you said you have him over ETN. And you also said you don't necessarily want to take Javonte over someone in the 5th round like Quentin Johnson. So how low do you have Travis Etienne? Because that's like, I'm pretty low on him, I think, relative to the market, but I think you're even lower than me.
I apologize. Just looking at my board now. I do have Javonte below Etienne. I have him higher than Austin Eckler, which might interest some people, and higher than Nick Chubb. But I have him in the same range as Pollard, Ramondre, and Jacobs. They're all in the same tier for me. It's just a matter of what you want from the position. Like, you're definitely going to get more production from those other 3 guys. I just think Javonte's production could come a lot closer, and I do think his upside is still higher in terms of his value. But I wouldn't blame anyone for taking a guy like Jacobs. The issue is, again, if you take a 26-year-old running back, your trading options are just limited. And I like to be a guy who, anytime someone's looking to trade someone in the league, I can offer them what they're looking for.
Yeah, it does limit your trading options more with the older guys. I guess J.K. Dobbins would be my counterpoint. I think the pass catching is definitely the missing piece here, that Javonte does have a higher ceiling in that regard than Dobbins. But if you look at last year, like, Dobbins came back, he struggled. And honestly, at that point, it was really hard to get anything from him in a trade. Like, because anybody that was contending obviously didn't want him. And then people that were rebuilding were like, well, I don't even know. Like, I don't know if he's going to be healthy again. I don't know what it's going to look like next year. I need him to play well again before I can really buy in. And so I had Dobbins on a couple teams and I felt pretty boxed in. I ended up selling low in one or two spots where I kind of regret it for like what amounted to like an early or mid second round pick. So that's where I think it could go for Javonte if he comes back and he's not himself right away. I don't know that you're going to have the flexibility that you think.
Yeah, and I get that. And I do like J.K. Dobbins. I think he's a good player. Obviously, he didn't look good coming back last season, but that's not really that big of a surprise. My issue with J.K. Dobbins, and you mentioned this earlier, I mentioned Javonte had 21 targets in his last 3 games. J.K. Dobbins has 32 targets in his career. And
yeah.
I'm just not interested. Like what is this guy's ceiling? Like at this point, I would rather just take a guy like Rachaad White 3 rounds later than a guy like J.K. Dobbins here, because he's going to split workload with Lamar Jackson, with Gus Edwards. It seems like they're going to throw more. They're not going to throw to the running back more because they have all these tight ends. I just don't see much upside. I think he's locked into, 12 and a half fantasy points a game, which is useful. But again, I just don't see the upside for him.
I think I'm a little higher on him than you. I think in this new offense, he could get up to like a 2.5 receptions per game kind of guy, kind of like Chubb has been throughout his career. I don't really have a great statistical analysis or like basis for that. That's what I think he can be in this offense. And so I'm a little bit higher on him, but we won't dwell on it there because I don't really have like an ace in the hole in that argument. I just like his price right now. I think he's my favorite out of that tier, but firmly below the guys we talked about earlier in my mind. Looking at tier 5 here, this is where things start to get really gross. I think we have 5 players, DeAndre Swift, Miles Sanders, Rachaad White, Joe Mixon, and Cam Akers, all going within about a round from the 704 to the 805. I don't know why Swift is at the top of this tier. I feel like his price is still way too high. I'd like to hear what you think about Swift, but I don't really know what we're hoping for. Like, he's going into his 4th season. He has no insulation left to speak of. He's just been traded for a conditional 4th round pick to a team that was dead last in running back target percentage last season. The Eagles had 61 total targets to running backs, and like that's where Swift makes his money, is in the passing game. So even if there's an uptick there, I don't really think there's a whole lot of upside. So in terms of like this year's projection and future value, I don't really see anything positive in Swift's profile. But what do you think about him as an asset at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree. By the way, the only other team with less than 60 pass attempts to running backs was Baltimore, just to point that out. But anyways, yeah, I completely agree with Swift. I mean, the thing is you need a Rashad Penny injury, which has been a good bet historically. And you probably need a Gainwell injury for him to actually be that effective, because he's not going to get the rushing workload that you're imagining from him. And like you said, why would they throw to the running backs? Because they have Jalen Hurts, who's not going to dump off, and they have 3 elite receiving options, or 2 elite and 1 good receiving option. So I agree. I don't see upside for Swift. I see no value floor. Like, if Swift came out, they decided they prefer Gainwell in camp, and Swift doesn't play week 1, that would not surprise me that much. So totally I don't know what you're getting from Swift. The only potential upside that I could see is next off season, some team signs him and it looks like he's going to be the belt, like Carolina did with Miles Sanders. But at that point, just buy Swift in December and cash in the value then. So yeah, I agree. I'm not buying Swift.
I don't know. Like, things would have to go so well for him in the offseason to become significantly more pricey than he already is. Like, as a second contract running back going like in his 5th year in the league, who's never really put together a full season, like, even if he does get a decent landing spot next year, is he really going to be going higher than like the 6th round in startups? That's where Dobbins is going. That's where Dameon Pierce is going. Like, I really don't think that there's a path for him, outside of the most narrow of outcomes. Like you said, a Penny Gainwell injury. But even then, like, I think they'd still just throw Boston Scott in there and give him half the goal line carries. Like, the Eagles, I don't know. I think the Eagles are very much like a talent driven kind of situation. Like, they're going to let the best players touch the ball. And it's not even like they have an investment in Swift that they have to pay off. No. It's a 4th round pick. So there's no guarantees here. And people are still kind of overestimating the talent. I think he does some things really well, but he's also made a lot of mistakes, and he gives coaches headaches sometimes with the decision making. And I just really won't be surprised if he has a pretty like mediocre role in this offense. I want no part of him at this price.
Yeah, I mean,
But
my projections have Swift outside the top 36 running backs. So
yeah, so you are not high at
no,
all. If
no.
you want to draft DeAndre Swift, take him in best ball. Don't take him
Yep.
in your dynasty startup, please. I'm begging you. What about well, Miles Sanders is another guy that I'm staying well away from. So maybe touch on Sanders um, and then give me your thoughts on Joe Mixon because I think he might be actually the best bet out of this group.
Yeah, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Miles Sanders because I'm actually in on Miles Sanders purely from essentially a redraft perspective. But why are you out on him?
Um, well, I don't think he's going to catch passes. First of all, I don't believe it. He was really bad in Philadelphia outside of his rookie year. He was really bad as a pass catcher. The team decided not to use him that way, even in the limited opportunities that there were. They really didn't want to throw him the ball. I guess I just don't believe that Carolina is actually going to utilize him that way. I also don't think it's going to be a very good offense. I don't think they're going to score that many touchdowns. And while Sanders has always been efficient in his career, he's also played behind arguably the best offensive line in the NFL.
Yeah.
He's going to a team that look. I don't stay up to date on all of the offensive line rankings, but I don't think the Panthers have a particularly incredible offensive line. Um, I don't think that having a rookie quarterback is really going to do him any favors in terms of opening up rushing lanes. I don't think that the wide receiver weapons in Carolina are going to do many favors in terms of opening up rushing lanes. Like, I just think he has a really uphill battle to provide anything more than like low end RB2 production.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't really think he's the kind of guy they're going to give 300 carries to, but
It's interesting because in a way I'm not interested because he has no value floor. So I would rather just take James Conner, right? Who's going to have just as good of a year, if not better. And neither of them have any like locked in role for 2024.
exactly.
But I think Miles Sanders is going to have a very good year. First of all, I think Chuba Hubbard is not even a real running back. I think Blackshear is probably the backup there. But I think Sanders is going to get basically all he can eat. Their offensive line was about average last season, but it is the only offensive line in the NFL returning all 5 of their starters, which is interesting. They're going to have a bad offense, but it's going to be an offense where I think there's a lot of dump offs. We know Jahmyr Gibbs led Alabama in receiving last year. I think that Bryce Young is going to throw to his running backs quite a bit. I don't think they're going to scheme up receptions for him. I think he's just going to get receptions because none of their wide receivers can get open, and Bryce Young is going to have to dump it off. So
Right.
I do see a pretty strong year ahead for Miles Sanders. That being said, I would much rather take some other upside wide receivers in this range, or typically get my second or third quarterback in this range. Guys like Geno Smith, Derek Carr, I much prefer to a guy like Miles Sanders.
I think that's a really solid counter argument, and I'll have to think on that. I do like what you're saying there, but I think what you brought up about who you'd rather draft is really the key because at the end of the day, this is still a dynasty show,
Yeah.
not necessarily a redraft show. And I like what you said about James Conner because I think in a lot of cases you could flip Miles Sanders for James Conner in a second, and I'd absolutely do that because then you get your projection for this season, you get your store of value much safer, and you just have these two separate assets that are really doing the job that Miles Sanders would be doing for you, but just more efficiently, in each side of it. So that's what I'd rather do. And I do agree in this like round 7, round 8 range. I love the wide receivers. You can get like Deontay Johnson, Calvin Ridley here. There's a lot of guys that I like in this range where I'd much rather be taking receiver than running back. If I don't get my running backs early, by the end of that like Nick Chubb tier, I'm just going to wait a while. I'm just going to wait. I'll let this group pass me by. I don't feel like I'm missing out on anybody here. But if there's somebody I am willing to take, I'm coming around on Joe Mixon as a decent buy because I think with every passing day, it's becoming more and more likely that he is the starter for the Bengals, that he's not cut or traded or arrested or suspended. It just seems like he's going to be the guy again. And that just seems like a better option or like a better version of what James Conner is offering you, right? He's going to be in one of the best offenses in the league. He's going to get a bunch of carries. Samaje Perine's gone. Maybe he gets even more receptions. He did set a career high last year. Like, this is just a guy I think you could kind of ride into the ground and get one more like RB1 season out of. And at his current price, I think that's pretty appealing.
Yeah, I don't think I don't think Joe Mixon is good at football anymore, but I don't think it matters. Like I have very
Exactly.
similar take as you do. He's going to get the workload, especially that because they lost P. Ryan. We haven't heard any rumors about Dalvin Cook, for instance, to Cincinnati. So what I'm doing in this range, I usually do grab a running back in the range of rounds like 8 to 11, but it's just whoever falls, whether it's Joe Mixon or James Conner or guys that we're going to touch on later like Aaron Jones. I'm not being picky in this range if I'm contending. I want one of those guys that's like just going to get me, low end RB1 production this year, but I'm not particularly picky about it.
Yeah, exactly. And the opportunity cost just isn't that high. Depending on how the wide receivers shake out, it depends on your draft room. Like sometimes the wide receivers just go insanely high, and then it's like all too easy to click the button on someone like Joe Mixon in the eighth or ninth round. But it's like in terms of other running backs, what are you passing up on, right? Like none of these guys are, even if they're young, are particularly safe, right? Like Cam Akers is another guy in this tier who's younger than Mixon. He might be better than Mixon, but really, what are you missing out on? I don't think he has a massive ceiling, and I don't think that he's necessarily safe beyond this season. So you're just not missing out on anything by grabbing Joe Mixon. I think that's something that I've kind of come to accept just this offseason is like the actual age doesn't really matter for most of these running backs because they're really on a year-to-year basis no matter what. Their values are going to fluctuate wildly based on the circumstances around them, and whether they're young or not just shouldn't make up that much of what we think of them.
Right. It's the years on the contract that matters more, which is why a guy like Rachaad White is more valuable than Cam Akers, even though I believe he's older because he has that extra years on his contract. Rachaad White is someone I do want to touch on. Is he in this tier or is that the next one?
He is in this tier, and that's a really good point about the years on the contract. So yeah, please follow up on White.
Yeah, so the thing about Rachaad White is that, and he's probably the guy in this tier that I would take, just because I do like the flexibility he provides, is that he does have a lot of upside this year. I mean, they didn't add anyone at the position. No, I don't care about an undrafted running back, so I don't want to hear about that. But he has that receiving upside. I mean, I think he has the number one yards per route run and target share of any running back taken in the first 3 rounds in the last decade, again, coming out of college. He was bad last year, but that whole offense was pretty much a mess. It's going to be a mess again this year, but I think he could get Miles Sanders type workload, except more of those touches being slanted towards receiving, which, as you mentioned, is 2.5 times more valuable than a carry. And more importantly, if he does have an RB1 year, now he's got 2 years left on a rookie deal. He was just drafted 2 years ago. So a lot of people are still, in on the post hype idea of him. So I could see his value upside hitting, the 5th round of startups next year if he does have a low end RB1 season. So from a value perspective, he's not safe, but I do see some upside for him where you could be kind of getting some production and value gain from a guy like Rachaad White.
I totally agree. Rachaad White has the most to gain out of this tier in terms of value. And it's like you said, it's because he's a year 2 back, and it's because he catches passes. You could grab him and get a high-end running back 2 season out of him. I think running back RB1 is a big ask, but not impossible.
No, you're right.
And then you could resell him, even if he's going in the exact same place next year. That's still a win because you're banking the production and you're not losing anything. And then you have an asset that's exactly the same value. So I do like him out of this tier as well. I think he is my favorite investment in this tier, especially if I'm not going like insanely win now, because then maybe I'll just take Mixon. But I do like that point there. We have 2 more tiers to get through, and we'll hit them a little more quickly just because the players are kind of less significant, less interesting. But tier 6 is going to start with Zach Charbonnet. And then we've got Isaiah Pacheco, Aaron Jones, Devin Achane, Alexander Madison, James Cook, Kendre Miller, Dalvin Cook. And this stretches from the 810 to the 1001. I'm kind of surprised that Madison's ADP isn't higher. Maybe it hasn't had quite enough time to adjust post Dalvin Cook release. I can't remember how far out we are from that, but it feels like it's been a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
I would think he would be up in that tier above, kind of going alongside Akers or Mixon, but I approve of his price here. I think that's more reasonable. But yeah, this is just a mixture of guys that for the most part, I want nothing to do with. Somebody like Isaiah Pacheco is kind of that classic low ceiling and low value insulation running back that's just kind of pointless in Dynasty. Like just trade for a dusty veteran that's going to score more points, or
Yep.
trade him for a draft pick that's not going to lose value. I don't really get what the use case is for an Isaiah Pacheco. But do you have thoughts on him specifically? And then is there someone in this group that you do like at cost?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not interested in running backs who catch less than one catch a game, especially with McKinnon still there, with CEH coming back. I'm not interested in Pacheco. This range, there's not a single running back here that I feel neutral on. So I'll just quickly say who I'm buying and I'm selling. I am buying Zach Charbonnet. I think his contingent upside is massive. I still believe in the talent. I'm buying Devon Achane for a similar reason. I just really like the upside there. Everyone else I am basically selling, specifically Pacheco, Madison, and both of the Cooks I am highly out on. The only guy I'm okay with at cost is Aaron Jones, but he is getting up there in age. I think he's 28, and we don't know what's going to happen in that offense. So I'm not going to roster a lot of Aaron Jones either. In general, I'm pretty much fading here because I can see guys going 3 rounds later who I value very similarly.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. I don't think I've drafted a single one of these guys in a startup, with the exception of I did draft Aaron Jones once this offseason. And in one league, I drafted Isaiah Pacheco, and then I immediately tilted. As my thumb was pressing the button, I was like, wait, don't do it. Like some kind of, I don't know, dark force had taken over my body. He was the last one left in the tier in my defense. And he had fallen past his ADP, like to the end of the 10th round, I think. So wasn't the worst thing in the world. But since then, I've kind of come to just accept that I would have been better off not taking him at all. I am fading this group. I think that the upside of someone like James Cook is definitely being overstated.
Yeah.
I think Dalvin Cook's washed. I like your point on Charbonnet. He's probably my favorite of this group, and he does go the earliest, so that makes sense. He at least has that hypothetical contingent upside, and he's a rookie. He's got that kind of prototypical build for a 3-down running back. So you can at least paint the picture there, which is important.
And you can paint the picture with him and with Achane as well of a huge value boost, right? Like
yes.
If Achane gets 150 touches this year, he's going to be going in the top 6 rounds next year. I actually have Achane and Charbonnet both in my top 24, which is the tier that ends around Miles Sanders. So I am higher on those guys for sure. What I like to do with running backs in this tier is wait till they get hype, flip them for another running back in this tier plus a second, and just repeat. So I recently traded Alexander Madison for Isaiah Pacheco and a second. Again, I don't love Pacheco, but I'm sure when Pacheco has a big week 1, I'll flip him for Kendre Miller in a second. Keep on going round and around.
That is a creative trade strategy, and I love it. You guys got to do that. Yeah, that's great. I do like Achane. I don't want to be misconstrued as some kind of sizist that absolutely hates Devon Achane. I do like him. I just preferred getting him in rookie drafts at the 112, 201, as opposed to the startup where I have all these other players available to me. It just feels like when I'm at that point in a draft, I'm still looking at wide receivers. I'm still looking at, other positions. Sometimes tight ends that I like will fall here, like Greg Dulcich and Michael Mayer. So it's one thing in a rookie draft. I don't mind rostering him at all. I think he does have that upside, but not my favorite pick in a startup. Last tier we'll hit, and then at that point it's like just pick your favorite guy. So this is our tier 7. We've got David Montgomery, Alvin Kamara, AJ Dillon, James Conner, Antonio Gibson, Roshan Johnson, Brian Robinson, not Bijan Robinson, Tank Bigsby, and Khalil Herbert. This stretches from the 10:05 all the way to the end of the 12th round. And there are some head scratching ADPs here, both that I think are too low and too high. Let's start with Alvin Kamara, because I'm becoming more and more inclined to buy Alvin Kamara as he gets lower and lower in ADP. Like, I really didn't think that I was ever going to get back in, but at this point he's going next to players that are just so uninspiring, that have like no upside to speak of. We saw Alvin Kamara still had an 18% target share last year. Like, even if he's not that good of a rusher anymore, I still think he has a pretty fantasy friendly role in an offense. Like, are we really going to fade him into the 11th, 12th round just due to the suspension fear?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes people overcomplicate this. Let's just look at the guys who played last year. I'm removing Connor and Kamara from this. Antonio Gibson, 11 points a game. David Montgomery, 11 points a game. Brian Robinson, A.J. Dillon, and Khalil Herbert all had less than 10 points a game. So what's the point, right? Like,
what's the point?
Kamara 2 years ago averaged 18 points a game. Even last year, he was at 14. James Conner the last 2 years has averaged over 16 points a game. So what's the point of rostering A.J. Dillon because he's 3 years younger than James Conner if you're never going to start him? And if you do, he's getting 5 less points a game. So this is the area where I'm either just waiting and taking the backups, 5 rounds later in startups, or I'm just taking the production. I agree with you on a guy like Kamara. I know his production has fell of late. The Saints were a mess last season. I think they'll be better this season. So even if I don't get him for the first 6 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it ends up being, who cares if he's giving me 14 points a game for the rest of the season? That's more than having 16 weeks of, 9 points per game from A.J. Dillon is ever going to do.
Yeah, exactly. I'm very much into buying Kamara at this price. I need to go out and get some shares because I don't think I have any at the moment, but I'm going to go out and put some feelers out, see if I can grab him on some of my stronger teams, maybe that need a running back. Regardless of Alvin Kamara's value, I do like David Montgomery, like in a vacuum. I think he's a solid guy to hold on to just because I think he has contingent upside. We know that he's been a player that's handled a lot of touches before. He's kind of bullied his way into the RB1 conversation once or twice. And so I at least think that he's going to have a standalone role similar to what Jamal Williams had last year. I don't think he's going to score 15 touchdowns, but he will have some utility on a week-to-week basis. And if Jahmyr Gibbs were to go down, I think he has the requisite skills to catch passes and get goal line work, all the high value touches in a good offense. So I do like David Montgomery as a bench piece.
Yeah, me too. And other than Montgomery, who I do like in this range, I'm going to go with guys like Tank Bigsby and Tajay Spears. Not necessarily over a guy like Alvin Kamara, but just because there is some upside there, particularly from a value perspective. I mean, if Derrick Henry gets hurt, you are getting a 24 first for Tajay Spears. So, and if Jahmyr Gibbs gets hurt, you might not get one for David Montgomery. So that's just like the upside game that I like to play once you get to, the 12th round, but it's nothing too inspiring at this point.
So Tajay Spears was actually the next running back in ADP after Khalil Herbert, and I decided to leave him out of the tier because I'm kind of a hater.
That's fair.
I don't know about that 24 first. I don't know if that's really I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Derrick Henry got hurt and they gave like Hassan Haskins half the carries and they gave Tajay Spears like a Devin Singletary role. Like, I don't know. But I don't do the film analysis, and just Tajay Spears just looked really uninspiring to me as a prospect. And you probably have a little more insight into how he plays. And
I wasn't in on him either. I'm not endorsing that I would pay a 24 first. I'm just endorsing that someone in my league would. But it's the reason that I like him over a guy like, let's say, Roshan Johnson is that Roshan Johnson needs 2 injuries. Tajay Spears needs 1. So that's
fair.
And you're right about Hassan Haskins, but people in the Dynasty community aren't going to view Hassan Haskins as a prevention to workload the way that he might be in reality. Go blue.
Yeah. I think him and Roshan are pretty close for me because I think Roshan's the better player. But I think you're right that Spears has the better situation. I guess what I would see happening if Derrick Henry got hurt is like, okay, we have a Ryan Tannehill or potentially Will Levis led offense that has Treylon Burks, Chigakonkwo, and nothing else. Like, I feel like we would just get a whole lot of like 12 carries for 23 yards for Tajay Spears for a few weeks. And then people would probably catch on that he's not it and he doesn't have a lot of upside, but who knows really. He's not even in this tier. So I don't know why I'm harping on him so much. But I do agree with your general point of passing up on these guys that continue to put up, 10 points per game year in, year out, that don't have a path to accruing value. I absolutely love Tank Bigsby in this group, especially going towards the end. I have a lot of shares of him because he's in a great offense. He has a 3-down skill set. I like this prospect profile. And outside of ETN, there's no other running backs there. So if he were to go down, if ETN were to go down, that is, I think he would get a whole lot of carries and a whole lot of targets. And I think he would know what to do with them.
Yeah, I love this discussion because I got my rankings up right now and I have Roshan over Bigsby. Doesn't make any sense. Got to switch that now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely prefer Tank. I've been taking a ton of him. I think he is. I think I have Tank Bigsby is my most drafted rookie. I believe
Mm.
that's true. I don't have it in front of me, but I think he was my most drafted rookie because I was able to get him at like the 209, the 210, the 301 constantly in my rookie drafts. And I was just like, okay, I'll just push the button again every single time.
Yeah,
I,
I have a fair amount of him. There's like 3 or 4 guys I have an absurd amount of, but I do have a fair amount of Bigsby as well.
Yeah, so I love him out of that group, and I don't see the point of AJ Dillon.
Yeah.
I don't get what him and Brian Robinson make no sense to me in this group. Like it's like the meme with all the soldiers and then the clown guy. And like,
Yeah.
why are they here? What is the deal with Dillon? Like he was going way too high last year, and then he absolutely flopped, and he's still going way too high. Like this is not an Aaron Rodgers offense anymore. We're talking about a backup running back in a Jordan Love led offense who might not be able to start until next year when he'll be what, 26?
Yeah. And why do we think he would start next year? He's not very good. So why wouldn't they
Right.
draft someone better?
But have you seen his quads? They're huge.
Yeah, right. He's got the quads. And
Yeah.
he does have like there are auxiliary metrics that still really like AJ Dillon. Like you want to know the top 7 in PFF rush grade? Josh Jacobs, Aaron Jones, Nick Chubb, Tony Pollard, Tyler Algier, AJ Dillon, and Derrick Henry. So like there are these stats that love him, but it's just not worth it. Don't do it. There's just no upside there.
Yeah, exactly. It's like such a thin path to that ever working out. I just don't see any reason. What about Antonio Gibson? Does he still have a path? Is there potential there? Can I have a little bit of hope?
I am more interested in Antonio Gibson. So the top 3 of this tier for me, sorry, the top 4, and the only 4 I'm really that interested in are gonna be Connor, Gibson, Bigsby, and Kamara. With a little love for David Montgomery as well. But I do like Antonio Gibson. 2 years ago, he put up 14 points a game. That was the same as what Kamara had last year. And there is some potential upside, right? He's had a lot of receptions. He's got good receiving skills. Again, you're not really buying him for any value floor. So why not just get James Conner? But right. I'm fine with Gibson at cost. He's the type of guy that if I'm downgrading or making a big package deal and I can get him thrown in, he could be a useful flex piece.
He's the arbitrage DeAndre Swift.
Yeah, no, I completely see that. Like I'm not sure why DeAndre Swift is going that far ahead of Gibson.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a similar bet because you're talking about a guy like he's going to make his hay in the passing game. Yeah. Both of them are in the same year of their careers. Neither of them have any value installation left. At least Gibson's still on the team that drafted him. So that's something.
Although I don't know if they like him either. And right. Gibson has I know Penny gets hurt all the time, but Rashad Penny's a much better runner than Brian Robinson. So I don't know.
Right. Exactly. Well, Ron Rivera is doing his yearly press tour for Antonio Gibson, hyping him up so that we can all be hurt again. I think he did set actually career highs in targets and receptions last year. So maybe he's kind of finding himself in that receiving role. And I don't know. I think he could have some low end RB2 upside this season, maybe more if Brian Robinson were to get hurt. So I find some appeal there. At least I know he catches passes and that's what I value, but definitely through this exercise, I was kind of coming around this way, but I'm definitely feeling more and more inclined to go buy the gross dusty veterans. Especially in these later tiers where I don't really think any of the players have league-breaking upside. I would rather just bank the points like we've been saying in a Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, James Conner, someone I know is going to give me 14 points per game as a baseline, rather than trying to play the middle ground and try to draft running backs that have maybe similar, some upside, but they also can be a store of value. Just tier down, grab the dusty veteran running back, and then store your value in picks, quarterbacks, stud tight ends, other positions. Just buy a running back and assume they're going to die on your roster. I feel like if we could get that in our heads, it would just be a lot easier to construct our teams and not find ourselves holding the bag on so many of these guys.
Yeah, exactly. And if you are intelligent, if you do Cam Akers, let's say for James Conner in a second, you get more production this year. Let's say James Conner retires next year. That's fine because Cam Akers is only worth a second anyways, so, and you got better production for a year. So I agree with that. shoot for upside in this late range and really near-term upside, because none of these guys have that much value upside once you get past really Charbonnet and Achane.
There you go. Love it. All right. Well, there are lots more running backs left, of course. I mean, there's dozens more that get drafted after this point, but we're not going to talk a lot about them because, frankly, there's just not all that much to say. They're all just different upside bets that have various paths to paying off. But I'd like to highlight, just to close things out, a couple of guys that you like, maybe a little more than the market, that are going after this 7th tier. And I'll bring up one name first, and then I'll let you go next. Make sure you don't steal my guy. My first one is going to be Damian Harris, who's going a couple rounds later, 13th, 14th round, who just signed with the Bills. He's 26 years old. He's always been a highly graded rusher per PFF. I don't believe in James Cook. We've never seen James Cook handle a large workload in college or in the NFL. So I think the bet here is pretty simple. I think Harris could outscore James Cook. He's super cheap. He's in a good offense. And so he's kind of borderline free points that you can buy and at least, throw into your flex spot if you need somebody.
Yeah, I like that. Another guy who, first of all, I love taking running backs in this range. Like, I think my ideal startup is 2 running backs in the first 12 rounds and then running backs in rounds 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, right? Like, just pile it up, see who gets hurt. Cause like you said, we're really just betting on injuries now. One of the guys I really like in this range is a guy who you have on this list. So I'll leave him for you, but other players I like: Jaylen Warren, Rashad Penny, Malik Davis, Keontae Ingram, and Jerome Ford are guys that I'm targeting in this range. Again, just looking for some contingent upside. If the starter gets hurt, what will their role be? Whether it's taking a guy who has a starter who hasn't gotten a big workload like Malik Davis, a starter who's not very good like Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris, or Keontae Ingram, who, I liked him okay as a prospect. He is literally free, and James Conner has a ton of injury issues, and they love giving the bell cow, 85% of the touches.
Yeah, those are all good ones. Those are all frequents of my startups as well. And I like your point about drafting running backs in this range, because if you look at the other positions, there's just nothing. I mean, it's a wasteland. All the starting quarterbacks are gone. And you look at the wide receivers that are going in rounds 13, 14. I mean, are you really going to draft Darnell Mooney? Are you going to draft Alan Lazard? Do you want Tank Dell? Like, this is the running back zone. Like, this is where you want to grab all these guys, because any one of these players, if they start for a week, they can be an RB2, and that's plenty. Like, that's all you need. If you piece together a bunch of these guys that can give you stretches of RB2 production, you can just pass up that whole Isaiah Pacheco tier, because you've basically just piecemealed together a whole season of them on these backups, because they're going to get starts. Like, you might not always find the right ones, but if you buy enough of them, if you get enough of them on your bench, between Malik Davis and Damian Harris and Keontae Ingrams, you're going to find some spot starts in there. So I love that. One of my favorites for the same reason is Elijah Mitchell. And thank you for leaving him for me. I appreciate it. He's very talented. We saw him as a rookie just blow up onto the scene. He stole Trey Sermon's lunch money. He's in an offense that's tailored to his skill set, as we've seen. And we know that Christian McCaffrey is a small, old running back with an extensive injury history. Like, Mitchell has his own injury concerns, fair enough, but it's really not hard to envision Mitchell having a prominent starting role down, at some point in the season. And that if he does, he's plug and play. He's not going to be ceding a lot of touches to Jordan Mason or Tyrion Davis-Price, who are the only other running backs behind him. Like, it's a set and forget it RB2 anytime that Christian McCaffrey doesn't suit up. And I don't really care that Mitchell is also injury prone, because he's so cheap. Like, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. I got a good, and I feel the same way about Rashad Penny, by the way. I have a strategy question for you.
Okay.
If let's say it's not a startup and you're looking at your team, you don't have a lot of these running backs, these, tier of backup running backs that we're advising to invest in. How do you go about getting them? Because let's say that, Jaylen Warren is worth a 3rd round pick objectively, which is about what it is. Mm-hmm. If someone sends me a 3rd round pick for my Jaylen Warren, I'm saying no, just because I know that he wants him, right? I'm like, why are you sending me an offer for this random dude? You must really want him. So how do you go about getting these players?
Well, first of all, you got to be very active on the waiver wire. Like, I think that's underrated in Dynasty. People think there's nothing out there. There's nothing, but a lot of times these guys that are on waivers become those running backs that you want. That was Jalen Warren last year, like undrafted free agent, didn't really get any buzz until in the summer. And he was a guy you could have picked up. So definitely keep an eye out for names that pop up. Obviously not the names we just mentioned. None of those guys are on waivers, but the next
same
guys.
with, by the way, Malik Davis last year, Keontae Ingram last year, Jerome Ford last year, just to give a few more examples.
Yeah. I mean, I picked up Ty Chandler in a ton of leagues during the season last year and over the offseason before Dalvin Cook got released. And now he's one of my highest rostered running backs. I don't know if that's going to pay off, but he certainly has a shot to be the RB2 there in Minnesota. So that's one way. And then other than that, it's really just try to get one thrown into every deal that you make. Like, usually someone like a Jalen Warren is not going to stand in the way of a trade getting done. If your trade partner wants a deal, they're going to still make the deal if you ask for Jalen Warren. So sometimes I have people that will make trades and they'll ask for an extra third or fourth round pick. That's a fine way to pick up value. But if you have a team that's not tanking, I'd rather try to throw in one of those backup running backs as opposed to the draft pick and just try to stockpile as many as you can that way. And please don't let your bench get clogged up with these, wide receivers, these deep wide receivers down the board. I promise you, like, you can drop Curtis Samuel and it's going to be okay. Like, you don't need to hold these receivers that are going to score 6-7 points per game. Just fill up your bench with as many running backs as you can.
Yep, 100%. And I like what you said about asking for these players instead of a third round pick and a bigger deal. The other thing that you can do is you can say, hey, throw in Jalen Warren and I'll throw in if you say throw in Jalen Warren and they say no, then say, oh, I'll give you a third back or I'll give you a fourth back, because then it seems like an afterthought. They're not going to let that hold up the deal, especially if you're giving equal value for a guy like that. But like you said, I like getting one of these guys thrown into most of my deals. And it's a good way to get rid of roster cloggers like your, Donovan Peoples-Jones and, Jacoby Myers and, Terrace Marshalls and these.
You can also try just trading those guys straight up for running backs. Like, it doesn't always work, but some people still think that there's upside in those guys, or like an Alec Pierce or something. Like, you can just try to throw them out there and grab an Elijah Mitchell or even a Khalil Herbert type, and then you can just hold on to that guy. So there are ways to get it done. You just have to be creative sometimes. I think that's a great question.
And a good way to put it, I have 48 wide receivers in my startup rankings before my 25th running back. However, I then have a set of 28 running backs before my next 26 receivers. So basically, after you hit the top 50 receivers, the top 25 running backs, then it switches to you should be acquiring these backs.
I think that's a really good way to picture it. Yeah, absolutely. And these wide receivers just keep getting pushed up the board. It's happening a lot on, platforms like Underdog, but it's happening in Dynasty too. People are just very afraid of running backs because it was kind of last year was kind of a 0 RB year. And so people are fading the running backs. It just goes in waves. But right now, especially, you can get running backs very cheaply compared to wide receivers. You got to play the board. You need to play the ADP game in front of you. And that's absolutely the right way to do it. So, Mike, this has been illuminating. I feel like I've learned a lot. I hope that the people have taken some things away. They have some trades to try out. They have some strategies to implement. This has been great. Do you have any final thoughts before I sign this out for everybody?
No, man. I think we covered it all.
Every running back take you'll ever need covered here on this podcast. I'm sure it will never seem outdated. And I bet everything we said today is 100% correct. Thank you guys so much for listening. The show's been picking up a little bit of steam. It's been really awesome just seeing the support coming in. And it's mostly thanks to the awesome guests that I've had on. So got to shout out Mike. Go follow him on Twitter at Dynasty Zoltan FF. Go check out his podcast, the Dynasty Zoltan podcast. I've been on it a few times. You can go find my episodes and of course, listen to the rest as well. Last thing I'll throw out there, just go over to dynastyfootballfactory.com. Consider grabbing the annual membership. It's only like $20 and you get to access the site, all the web articles, all the rankings. You get to join the Discord server where you can talk with me and a lot of the other guests that you've seen on this program. So I think it's a good value. I think you should check it out. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Paul_DFF. All right, everybody, that's it for this week, but I will see you again next time on the Factory Tour.